Welcome to this another episode of Facts. Today, I'm going to be joined by a very special guest discussing another book. Anything Lewis or Tolkien, we want to always bring on guests that have that discussion, who have written books about these things. And today it's going to be a special treat. I hope you're looking forward to it. I want to introduce my guests in just a second, but I want to talk about the importance of reading outside of the actual documents themselves. Like, we all love reading Lord of the Rings, Hobbit. We love reading Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, any of these books that we have come to really love and appreciate. And now that there's fantasy and movie being made about them, we like these things. But I think it's good to read scholars who have spent hours upon hours reading beyond those pages, but reading about the authors, their lives, their lifestyles, their perspectives, their trainings and backgrounds. These things are important, and that's why we have these kinds of episodes. And there's a book that's going to be promoted today that I would love for all of you to get your hands on. I'm going to have a link right here in the description of the video. You can get it. It's very affordable. It's easy. Amazon will send it to your door in a couple of days. I really encourage you and my audience to read this book because it's going to be a blessing. And he has other books that we'll talk about as well. But I want to make sure that we are promoting this works. I think you will be encouraged. I think you will actually be wowed. I think there's going to be a wow factor for many of you in the audience. So I'm going to bring on my special guest today. I have Dr. Michael Ward with me. He's a professor at the University of Oxford. He is in the Department of the Faculty of Theology and Religion. He has authored over 7 books, including the book we will discuss today, Planet Narnia. Dr. Ward, thank you for joining the program. Go ahead and give a quick shout out about your book. It's in the background right behind you. If people can see in the camera, those that are watching on the YouTube side, this book is an incredible book. I think you made some groundbreaking work here. And what inspired you to actually produce something like this?
A lifelong interest in C.S. Lewis. By the way, thank you for having me on the program, Stephen. I was raised in a Christian family, and my parents read the Narnia books to me before I was old enough to read them for myself. And then when I was old enough, I read them repeatedly and got into Lewis's other fictional works and his Christian apologetics. Then I came to Oxford, where I'm speaking to you from today, and I studied English for my undergraduate. And for the first time, I studied Lewis sort of formally and officially for my undergraduate degree, which led to a bit of lecturing and teaching after I'd graduated, then a bit more lecturing and teaching and a bit of writing. I ended up living in Lewis's Oxford home, the Kilns, for 3 years as a kind of warden in charge of that house, living in Lewis's bedroom and study, having those to myself. Wow. It was a cool experience. And then when it came time for me to do my doctorate, C.S. Lewis was the obvious choice because I was already quite expert in his writings. And halfway through my doctoral research, I stumbled across what I believe to be the sort of inner workings, the imaginative blueprint of the Narnia books. And that's what Planet Narnia is all about.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect, that you actually got to walk in some of the same steps, like the same sidewalks, the same buildings. You almost got in his head a little bit and got to experience his everyday life. Like, what would it felt like the breeze hitting you in a certain summer day over there? Like you got to almost live into the reality of the world that he lived in, with structures, buildings, places. And I think that's an important element that is often missed in book writing. And I saw this with Dr. Hawley as well, that she was able to go to a lot of the same places, particularly that Professor Tolkien went to. That's huge, because now you're living into their reality, not just reading their words. And I think that kind of opens a path of mind and a mindset to think the way they're going to think with the culture and context around you. So that's pretty exciting. Now, when you look at this book, I mean, you bring out the idea of the 7 heavens, particularly from medieval cosmology. Now, I don't think if someone is reading a lot of Lewis, they would instantly go to that. But once you actually start connecting some of the dots, you're like, hey, I think that's actually really brilliant. There is some medieval cosmology here, but like, I don't think an initial read would just have somebody run to that result. But once it's pointed out, it seems like that's going to be the case. So in the idea of core ideas or core values of this, you said that you grew up reading and having read to you a lot of Lewis's work and you've been a part of this, but was there like a particular moment that led you to say, I'm going to write a book because I see these dots connected and I think it needs to be heard?
Yeah, 18 months into my PhD, I had a brainwave, a bolt from the blue, as it were, and I thought, yes, of course, that's what Narnia is designed according to. But of course, every sudden moment has a history, and in my case, it consisted of nearly 30 years reading of Narnia and Lewis generally, and then some serious period of official study and research into his writings. And I'd been aware for a long time that Narnia, the Chronicles, the 7 books, are often criticized for being a bit of a hodgepodge. Tolkien was the first person to make that criticism. He said, why would you, C.S. Lewis, put into a single story so many disparate elements, English children alongside characters from Greek and Roman mythology, alongside Father Christmas, alongside, this white witch who seems to have stepped out of the pages of a Hans Andersen fairy tale. How do they all belong in a single world? And Tolkien didn't much like it. And as a result of Tolkien's fame, people have assumed that he knew the Chronicles much better than he actually did. I don't think he read them all even once, let alone repeatedly. And he disliked quite a lot of what Lewis wrote, as it happens. But people have thought, oh yeah, Tolkien dismissed them as a bit of a hodgepodge. Yeah, the Chronicles, we shouldn't take them too seriously. That's been one major attitude. And another is, well, think again, because we know that Lewis wasn't typically a random or a careless writer or thinker. He was a very rigorous, consistent thinker, a very disciplined mind. And indeed, he speaks quite frequently of his love of complexity and intricacy. And especially with regard to medieval writers, whom he studied as an academic here at Oxford, he said medieval writers love to present us, very often, he said, with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these writers, he says, but often by very intricate paths. They love to present us with something which at first looks planless, though all is planned. So following that line of inquiry, maybe there's a hidden plan. Various scholars and critics have suggested that Lewis was working to a scheme of his own devising that is sort of hidden in the text, and various theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins or the 7 sacraments, or any 7 that people can think of, basically. Interestingly, the one 7 that is all over Lewis's writings, the 7 heavens, the 7 planets of medieval cosmology, had not been considered seriously until I came along. And when you look at Narnia through the lens provided by the 7 heavens, all these oddities and apparent inconsistencies suddenly make perfect sense.
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to use the word groundbreaking, because I think what you did was groundbreaking. Because there was a lot of debate about, like you said, the consistency, the harmony of the 7 books. I mean, you're looking at these different elements that Lewis wrote, and it does seem like a hodgepodge in some ways. But actually, once your book was released, I think it really helped harmonize perhaps the heartbeat behind these books. And for those that are unfamiliar, when you're talking about medieval cosmology, the 7 classical planets that are mentioned would be Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And all of these books would have been tied to that, particularly The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I would say is probably the most notorious and famous that people are familiar with, would be connected to Jupiter, symbolizing simply kingship, being a major theme there. Prince Caspian, Mars, going back to war, courage, virtue of knightly virtue. Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Sun, Silver Chair, the Moon, the Horse and the Boy, the Mercury, Magician's Nephew, Venus, and Last Battle, Saturn. So when you looked at this from your perspective and you're studying these things, do you believe that Lewis intentionally wanted to keep this kind of under the radar where people would almost not figure it out? Like, was he intentionally going for, I'm going to connect these things and I'm going to make it so secretive that people would not even pick up on it unless they really, really, really knew me? So you even said, like, it seems like even Tolkien, who was very, very close to him, didn't even pick up on something like this. Do you think that was intentional, or is that just something that he probably didn't mean to do?
No, it was absolutely intentional. And that's why it took so long to be discovered, because it's not obvious, it's not explicit. Lewis didn't tell anybody about it. But the whole point of keeping it secret was, well, twofold, really. There were two main reasons. One is literary, and the other is theological. And the literary reason for keeping it secret, that is to say, just embedding these qualities and attributes of the seven heavens into the whole story, was connected with what Lewis said about a well-told tale, that it shouldn't just have a clever plot, a sequence of events. It should have an atmosphere, what he calls a pervasive tone or flavor or mood. The best stories, he says, the ones we tend to want to reread, have not just a clever plot, but also a believable kind of three-dimensionality to them. We like occupying that imaginative space. We're not just interested in what is happening, but in how it's happening, why it's happening, where it's happening, the people to whom it's happening. So, you know, an example he gives of a bad story is The Three Musketeers. He says, you know, that's a very exciting plot, a rollicking good story, but the story has no weather, has no background. When the characters go from London to Paris, there's no sense that Paris is any different kind of a place from London. You know, it's got a kind of two-dimensionality. It's like the back flats on a stage set. It's not a place where you think you could live for any length of time. But a great story has a kind of oxygen, an atmosphere that you can breathe, and you just like revisiting that imaginative space, like you enjoy going back to your favorite places in the real world. So Lewis will talk about the Londonness of London, or the Donegality of Donegal, which was one of his favorite places in Ireland to go holidaying. He said it's very hard to put the spirit of a place into words. You know it when you're there, and when you try to analyze it, you can't really point to any single thing in which the spirit is located, because it's in everything at once. And a good storyteller will conjure that kind of spell, but it's not something you look at as you read. It's something you look along. It's the whole field of vision that you occupy. So that's why it had to be kept secret from a literary point of view. And Lewis calls it in one place the kappa element in romance, by which he means that the cryptic element, the hidden element. It's hidden effectively because you're inside it. So that's the literary reason. And then the theological reason is that, you know, Lewis is using these seven heavens, these seven planets, in a Christian way. He had a theological imagination, and he said that the seven heavens were spiritual symbols of permanent value that were especially worthwhile in his own generation. I'm quoting him exactly there. And so he takes each of these seven planetary symbols, spiritual symbols of permanent value, and he uses them to control the way that he depicts Aslan, you know, the Christ character, the kingly lion who's the center of each story. Aslan is, you know, depicted in a kind of jovial, a Jupiter sort of way in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. His kingliness is constantly emphasized there. He's the one who summons everyone to the battle in Prince Caspian, the martial story, the one that's full of military events. He's the one who scatters light from his mane in The Dawn Treader, because that's the book written to suggest the imagery of the sun, and so on, 7 times over. So Aslan is the true Mars, the true Venus, the true Mercury. And if we were thinking in biblical terms, we would say, you know, God, Christ, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, or we'd say God is the Lord of Hosts, mighty in battle, or we'd say with Jesus in John's Gospel, I am the light of the world. So this planetary imagery is entirely consistent with biblical language, biblical formulations of the divine nature. But Lewis is not just, as it were, starting and stopping with biblical imagery. He's rooting everything in the Bible, yes, but he's enriching it and supplementing it with all this classical mythology and indeed medieval cosmology in order to give it this sort of imaginative heft and resonance. And that's one of the reasons why I think Narnia is so popular, because it's connecting with all sorts of things in our history and culture that make it feel special, that make it feel rich. But again, it's secret. It's not made explicit. You just sense that Aslan is the jovial center of a generally jovial world in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That he's the martial center of a generally martial world in Prince Caspian, and so on, 7 times over, which Lewis thought was a good way of depicting a theological truth, which is that Jesus Christ is the Word of God. He's the incarnate Word. He's the Word made flesh. But that Word of God is also the Word that has brought everything into being. So that there's a harmony between the cosmic Christ, you might say, the Word that is creating and sustaining all things, and the incarnate Jesus Christ, Jesus himself. And that's what I think theologically Lewis is trying to get at. He's trying to suggest it, he's trying to make us feel it from within, but not make it explicit. So he had to keep it secret for that reason.
See, this is a new level of brilliance, because at the end of the day, most scholars would like to have their name mentioned and their discovery mentioned and known, because if you don't, your brilliance is kind of hidden. But in this, we've now discovered through your research the brilliance behind that, because that's a deeper level of brilliance. That's not a surface level. This is something that almost has made a part of who Lewis was, like his personality, the way that he viewed the world. And this is something that created a beautiful thing that we're all looking back. And this is why I think, I'm going to use it again, the groundbreaking work you've published has caused us not just to think better of the series, but better of Lewis and how deep his brilliance is. And so when he wrote all of his other works outside of the Chronicles of Narnia, do you see some of this spill into some of his other works and other his writings as well, in addition to that?
Yes, it's all over his output as a writer and a thinker. He was deeply, deeply interested in the planets, especially the medieval planets, and in cosmology and the history of science generally. It's a major theme in one of his academic books, The Discarded Image, for instance, but also in his book on the 16th century, which begins with a long passage all about the new astronomy that came in the middle of the 16th century, thanks to Copernicus, when Copernicus revolutionized astronomy with his theory of the geocentric cosmos. Until the middle of the 16th century, people still believed that the Earth was central, but Copernicus said, no, we're centered on the sun. It's a heliocentric cosmos. Did I just get that round the wrong way? It's a heliocentric cosmos that we live in, and the Earth goes around the sun. The sun doesn't go around us.
Right.
And Lewis wanted to explore that from the point of view of a literary critic and literary historian, because he wanted to see how that scientific revolution played out in the literature of the period. So it was a big thing for him academically, but also religiously. As a Christian, Lewis said in his book on the Psalms that Psalm 19 is the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And how does Psalm 19 begin? The heavens are telling the glory of God. He was also quite a keen amateur astronomer. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He often liked to go to the local observatory. He would point out unusual conjunctions of the planets in the night sky. But also, from the point of view of an imaginative, creative writer, he loved the planets sort of poetically and symbolically, which is why he uses them so frequently in his poetry, but also, much more obviously, in his trilogy of interplanetary adventures, the Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, That Hideous Strength. That trilogy of books is drenched in medieval cosmology. And if you're missing that, you're missing half the story.
That's intriguing that he was so enamored with this and looking at it from, well, how did they view the planets? What's the new scientific? I mean, you almost wish he could live to our day and see some of the things that have developed in the sciences of today, looking at the different planetary, the different constellations. I mean, like, you almost wish it's like, what would he have written today? Like, you almost want him to be around to see how he would have created a whole new idea here. But obviously, the Lord had better plans for him and at his time. But when you look at his brilliance in this, who you are and what you are fascinated with will come out in what you write. I mean, that's just true of all of us. What you're passionate about, what you study, who you spend time with, it will influence you. I mean, we see this even in the writings of Tolkien. I mean, at times he was critical of Lewis, but he valued his opinion on everything. Anything Tolkien wrote. I mean, we see this in his letters to his son. Lewis was reading through everything that he was writing. Lewis had a way of critiquing things in such a precise but yet loving way that anybody valued his opinion because he was a deep thinker, very deep thinker. And so I love the fact that Lewis was able to get into these things. Now, as it looks into your work here, when you started writing this, was there ever a point where you ran into some major brick walls that you hit and said, maybe I need to change directions, or is there something that happened that struck you, that changed the trajectory of the work, that you had tended to go one way, but you had to go a different way because you discovered, like, was there a major breaking point in your research where it changed the trajectory of how you started writing your book?
Yeah, well, the major change in my research was this bolt from the blue when I suddenly thought Narnia and the heavens are connected. The book wouldn't have been written unless I'd had that brainwave. But the brainwave came about because I had been spending the first 18 months of my research looking at what Lewis calls wordless prayer. That's quite a significant theme in his book on prayer, Letters to Malcolm. And I wanted to understand what he meant by praying wordlessly. Especially why would C.S. Lewis, who was such an articulate man, think that the best kind of prayer was the prayer without words? And he says that you shouldn't verbalize the mental acts insofar as that's possible. So what does that even mean? So I was looking at how Lewis thinks about saying things without saying them. That is to say, implicit communication, indirect communication, symbolic communication, not just precise verbalization of an idea, but the evocation or the suggestion of an idea, so that you kind of say it without saying it. That, he thought, was the best kind of prayer. And also, he thought poetically that was the best kind of poetry, that you should not just state your theme, but suggest it, make the reader discern it without spoon feeding it, ramming it down the reader's throat. So anyway, I'd spent, as I say, a year and a half looking at this idea. And then one night I was lying in bed, just about to turn out my light and go to sleep. I was reading Lewis's long poem about the planets, a poem that he wrote a decade and a half before the first Narnia book came out. And this long poem describes each of the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos in great detail. And the lines about Jupiter suddenly leapt off the page at me, especially when Lewis says that one of the things that the Jupiter influence was held to bring about in the Middle Ages was winter past and guilt forgiven. And those 5 words leapt off the page at me: winter past, guilt forgiven. And I thought, well, that's like a summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was all about the passing of the White Witch's winter and the forgiving of Edmund's guilt. So I began to think, is there a possible connection between Jupiter imagery and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And it was pretty easy to see that there was. And then I thought, well, there are another 6 planets and there are another 6 Narnia books. Is it possible that they all connect? And again, it was pretty easy to me to see that they did connect. You asked about whether I hit any brick wall, and I never hit a brick wall. I was immediately convinced that this was the answer to the puzzle that had occupied so many Lewis scholars for so many years. including me, for instance. I previously made a half-hearted attempt to link the Chronicles to plays of Shakespeare, but I gave up on that idea. It wasn't getting me anywhere. But I immediately thought, oh yeah, this is definitely it. I just now need to work it out in detail. The only wrinkle I experienced was with Prince Caspian.
Okay.
It was pretty obvious to me that Prince Caspian was the Mars book. It's the Great War of Deliverance. It's the Civil War of Narnia. The word marshal itself appears several times in Prince Caspian, but never in any of the other Narnia books. But what troubled me, what puzzled me, was that there's a strong theme in Prince Caspian of trees and forests. You remember how Lucy tries to wake the trees?
Yes.
They don't come alive until Aslan is present. And then there's this bacchanalian romp with the swaying trees and the growing vines, and the wood comes to the battle at the end of the story. I thought, why all these trees? What's that got to do with Mars? My own classical education is very weak. I wasn't properly educated in the classics. But it didn't take much digging to discover that in Roman mythology, Mars was not always and only associated with war. He was originally a vegetation deity associated with trees and forests, and he was called Mars Silvanus, Sylvan, pertaining to trees, like Pennsylvania, Transylvania. And as soon as I thought that, oh, well, of course, that just makes it even clearer that Prince Caspian is the Mars. But that just speaks to my ignorance and Lewis's classical learning. And I'm sure there are all sorts of classical things that I'm missing in the books because I don't have his background in that field.
That is a fascinating. I would have never put that together either. When you think about Mars, it's like trees, Mars. But that makes absolute sense if we go back to the ideas, the mythology that's in that. I mean, this is why folks that are listening to this, whether you're watching this in the premiere or you're listening to this on the podcast, hit the link about the book, buy the book. All right, listen, because we're just giving you snippets of the awesomeness of this book and the connections that Lewis was trying to make that we've overlooked for a long period of time. And thanks to Dr. Ward, we've actually now seen the light of day. And I think this is actually going to create further discussion now that pieces are being put together, because the volumes are quite big. And in these volumes, we're going to start seeing connections. And hopefully, as you read these things, when you go back and you read The Lion, the Witch, the War of Prince Caspian, once you start reading these books, perhaps you'll start seeing more connections. My son is 11 years old. In his summer reading, he's at a private school here in South Carolina. They were required this year to start reading in not school time, but in the summertime, some of the books. And one of the ones that he was suggesting allowed to read is Lewis. And I had somebody say, another parent say, they're a little bit too young to be reading Lewis at this point. I said, no, this is perfect. My son read The Hobbit at the age of 7, and he's almost finished with The Lord of the Rings. He's been reading that. He's through book 1. I love the fact that he had to actually start reading some of these books. Now, he even said he was expecting every book to be like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But, as a result, he had to start reading he's reading The Magician's Nephew. And when he's reading The Magician's Nephew, he's like, this is very different than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But my son is asking questions as an 11-year-old. And that's my next question here is like, when you look at C.S. Lewis's work, it is so far reaching that even younger children are encouraged. Like you said, your parents read to you, and, we're requiring it for academia. When we get into this, it's far reaching, and people are going to miss this element, but yet the work still has major influence. So much they're doing shows and movies, probably butchering it like anything else, but they're inspired to do something to show the world what was in the world of Lewis. So even if you're missing these elements, what is it about the Narnia series that still grips people, even if they can't make these connections?
Well, you say that they are missing the elements, and I know what you mean. They are not consciously
right.
equating this particular symbolic atmosphere in, say, The Horse and His Boy with the imagery of Mercury. They're not making that conscious connection. But if they're reading the book with sympathy and with attention and sensitivity, then they are intuiting these connections. They are sensing them and feeling them at a symbolic or poetic level. And that's exactly how they were meant to perceive them. That's why Lewis embedded this imagery deep beneath what he would call our contemplative consciousness. He divided consciousness into two modes. We can either contemplate things from the outside in a sort of fact-based and scientific, disinterested observer's neutral point of view. That's one way in which we know things, but we also know things through what he calls enjoyment consciousness, when we enjoy a thing from within, when we step inside it and participate it and know it by acquaintance. That's the other way in which we're conscious of things. And it's that second kind of consciousness, the enjoyment consciousness, that I think he's trying to speak to with this hidden imagery, so that we feel it from within. You want to know what it's like to live in a jovial world? Read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You want to know what it's like to live in a world dominated by Venus? Read The Magician's Nephew, and so on. It's a very skillful way of enacting Lewis's own epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we are conscious of things. And that was Lewis's epistemology, that we're not just either asleep or awake. No, when we're awake, we're operating in one or two modes of consciousness. We're either looking along things from within, or we're looking at things from without. He talks about this all over the place, and it was a major element in his own path to Christian faith, that he began to realize that God is not just someone or something to look at, but someone to look along, to participate in, to become one with. That's what the doctrine of the Trinity allows for, that the Holy Spirit can get inside us, and we can look at Jesus as our brother, but unless we have the Spirit inside us, we don't identify Jesus as the Christ. We just look at him as another Jewish rabbi. But if we're sort of in the Spirit, then we can identify Jesus correctly. So, it's very deep theological truth that Lewis is actually depicting with you might say disarming simplicity, in the sense that he's writing books that a 7-year-old kid can enjoy. But enjoy is the key word. He's writing a very attractive, winsome story with exciting episodes, which catches a child's imagination, and all the while the child is imbibing a kind of deep theology and epistemology and spirituality. This is one of the reasons why the Narnia books are works of such staggering genius.
Yes. Can you kind of go into some of the lesser known planetary influences, say Saturn, for example, in The Last Battle? Like the themes, the ideas. To me, I think some of these other ones are more relatable, but where do you see that one specifically? It's a lesser known, like Saturn, how that really influenced The Last Battle. Because I probably, would you say that's the least known, or would you say maybe Mercury is the least known? But these are lesser known.
I would say that the least well-known of the 7 books is The Horse and His Boy, because that's the one which is a bit of an outlier. It's not mostly set in Narnia. It's set mostly in Calaman and Archenland, and there's only one chapter set in Narnia itself, and it's got a set of characters that don't appear in the other books very much. So, Mercury. Let me talk briefly about both Mercury and Saturn. Mercury. Think of Mercury. People have probably seen statues of Mercury or pictures with his wings on his heels and wings on his helmet, and he's the messenger of the gods. He's zipping around, carrying messages and doing commerce and that sort of thing. He's the lord of language. That's how Lewis describes him in his poem on the planets. Now think about The Horse and His Boy, how it begins in Calaman, this southern country, where we're told on the very first page that all the Calamines talk very slowly and in words that sound very dull, and all the animals are dumb and witless in Calaman. In other words, it's a land where there's no Mercury, there's no mercurial influence being felt. And that's why the characters have to escape from Calaman and go to the Narnia in the north. And as they go, they begin to learn how to speak. The very first words that Aslan says when he encounters Shasta in the mountain pass, you remember Shasta doesn't know who Aslan is.
Right.
And Shasta says, "Who are you?" Scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak." That's Aslan's very first sentence in the book, because he's, as it were, wanting to give Shasta mercurial power. Think of the scriptural line about the word of God living and active. Hebrews, he wants that living, active articulation to become alive in Shasta's soul. One who has waited long for you to speak. And as Shasta and Aravis go to the north, they discover what poetry is for. At the feast, when the blind bard steps forward and strums his lay and begins to tell of poetry, of love and war, and a rocket goes off in their heads, and they suddenly realize what poetry is for. Because all they'd known before that was the Calamine kind of poetry, which is, sententious and lugubrious and boring. So those are just some of the ways in which the mercurial aspect is coming through in The Horse and His Boy. And there are many, many others. I think the way Lewis puts Mercury in The Horse and His Boy is just fantastic. So sophisticated, so subtle and clever. But we must press on to Saturn and the last battle. So Saturn is a very different kind of spiritual symbol. He symbolizes the end of life, darkness, coldness, melancholy, and ultimately death, loneliness, separation. So this is obviously very appropriate for the final episode of the Narnia Chronicles, the last battle. It's the biblical it's the Narnian equivalent of the biblical story of the Day of Judgment, the Book of Revelation. This is the apocalypse. Yes. Everything goes wrong in the last battle, and everybody eventually dies. And who is it that brings Narnia to an end but Father Time? Now, interestingly, Father Time had been introduced 3 books earlier in The Silver Chair. The characters in The Silver Chair see Father Time sleeping in the underworld cavern.
Yes,
and
yes.
And we're told in The Silver Chair that he will wake, Father Time will wake on at the end of the world. Now, interestingly, this is one of the more exciting discoveries I made. In the Bodleian Library here at Oxford, there is a typescript of The Silver Chair, a rough draft, a typed version, before it became published. And in the typescript of The Silver Chair, when that character asleep in the underworld is described, he's described not as Father Time, but as the god Saturn. He will wake on the day that the world ends. Wow. So there in the typescript, Lewis, as it were, gives the game away.
Wow.
But when he came to publish The Silver Chair, he thought, I better make my planetary scheme a little bit more covert so I don't give the game away. And obviously, when he came to write The Last Battle, where Father Time indeed wakes up, he, again, made sure that he didn't call him Saturn, even though Father Time and Saturn are exactly the same character, mythologically speaking.
What a discovery. Did you find that? Did you find that before, during, or after you wrote the book in the library?
I found it before. It was brought to my attention very kindly by the late Walter Hooper, and he pointed it out to me.
Wow. So if you needed any more confirmation, it's like, as if you needed any more confirmation. It's like, well, if there was any doubt, if I was 99.9% sure this is what Lewis was doing, that almost puts the nail in it, like to give you that, this is what he was doing.
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, I'm convinced of it in any case. That was just sort of the cherry on the cake. But yeah, it's a nice little kind of smoking gun from the point of view of documentary evidence.
What a connection to And I just remember, as you said that, it reminded me, I'd forgotten that he was already perceived earlier as asleep. He's being reserved for the, I mean, this is what's happening. This is going to, because if you don't read that section, you get to the very end and you forget that. And it's like, oh, he's put a thread here. He's put a thread all the way through. That's extraordinary. Now, how do you see his world, where he ties in some of this mythology? Because, you know, there's a lot of debate with Tolkien about the word allegory. I mean, that was a big pet peeve of his. How do you see the world of Narnia, say, versus Middle Earth, and their tie-ins with the mythological beings and so forth? How does his work compare to, say, his buddy Tolkien? How do their mythology views? How are they this? How are they similar, but how are they different?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, obviously, both the Narnia Chronicles and the Lord of the Rings are fantastic works of literature in the sense that they are, you know, fantasies. They are alternative realities. They are not realistic novels. So they share that basic generic similarity. Beyond that, they are extremely different, because Middle Earth, Tolkien's imagined world, has a sort of what he called the inner consistency of reality to it. It's not realistic, but nonetheless it's real within its own frame of reference. Tolkien thought that you should be able to suspend your disbelief and find a home in a sub-created world which was so convincing that you could take it for real, even though it's got wizards and elves and goblins and whatever else, magic rings. Tolkien said that that suspension of disbelief was fundamental to his whole notion of creative activity, and that introducing any element that broke the magic spell was ruinous. And that's why he goes to such depth, you know, such lengths to provide languages and histories and genealogies, cartographies, appendices.
Yes.
You know, the Lord of the Rings is published with, I think, 8 appendices, because he wants everything to have this ring of truth about it. Whereas Lewis's world is very different. Indeed, he's almost deliberately breaking the spell, you might say, with these odd elements. Father Christmas, for instance, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or Bacchus turning up in Prince Caspian. Even as a child, I thought, this is slightly odd. What's going on here? And indeed, when I had my brainwave, some of these oddities that I perceived, even when I was a kid, suddenly came to mind. And I thought, right. So that explains why, for instance, in to go back to The Horse and His Boy, you have an unnamed minor character in The Horse and His Boy. He does nothing. We're not told who he is, but we are told that he wears a hat with little wings on either side of it.
Yeah.
And I'd always been perplexed from boyhood onwards. Why are we told nothing about this character except about his headgear? And it's because that hat with wings on either side of it is a nod, a little nod and a wink, you might say, from C.S. Lewis. If you're wanting to know what the inner meaning of this story is, think of characters who wear hats with wings on, like Mercury, for instance, like Hermes. He's almost giving the game away there, but because it's so minor, so seemingly unimportant, you just dismiss it, especially if you're minded to conclude that Narnia is a hodgepodge in any case. But this brings me on to a more serious, significant reason why Lewis kept it secret. And that is, remember Lewis's own personal journey to faith. He had once been an atheist. He had once dismissed the cosmos, the real world cosmos, as purposeless, as pointless, as just a collocation of atoms bumping against each other randomly without any significance. And that had been his attitude for many years. Then he became a Christian, and he underwent a complete 180-degree transformation in his view. He no longer saw the cosmos as just empty space, black and cold and hollow. He now saw it as the heavens that are telling the glory of God. And I think one of the reasons he wrote Narnia in the way that he did was to, as it were, reenact that transformation at the imaginative level, so that he presents Narnia ostensibly without much pattern or design, and indeed he allows readers to dismiss it as a hodgepodge. All the while, Lewis, knows exactly how he's tying everything together. And he's waiting, as it were, for the reader to get on the right wavelength, to perceive these connections, and then say, oh yeah, God is working his purposes out as year succeeds to year. All things work together for good for those who love God. There's plenty of evidence on the other side of the ledger to say, oh yeah, the universe is just random and meaningless, and people suffer innocently and pointlessly. Yeah, there's plenty of evidence for that. But it was an article of faith for Lewis that, no, despite all appearances to the contrary, we can trust in a loving and good God. And we can do that because God has entered our world and suffered alongside us in the person of Jesus.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. I think that's well put. And folks, again, as we close this segment, I cannot encourage you enough to read Dr. Ward's book. I really think if you grew up on Narnia, even if you're unfamiliar with some of the books in the Chronicles, you just know Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe or Prince Caspian. I think what it'll do is once you read this book, it'll push you to read all the others. Maybe you're somebody listening to this on the YouTube or on the podcast channels, and all you've ever watched was the movies. It's time to read the books. It's time to grow past the milk and get them.
If they have never read Narnia,
sure,
no, they should just go straight to Narnia, enjoy the Chronicles for the story, and then if they want more, read my Planet Narnia, or indeed if they don't want all the detail and footnotes of this long, complicated book, there is actually a simpler version called the Narnia Code, which is written at a much more popular and accessible level. Then go back to Narnia and begin to see the connections. But I mean, seriously, I think the important thing, especially for children, is to have an innocent encounter with Narnia as a story world which they just enjoy, and they're not trying to analyze it or allegorize it. That's quite against what I believe my work is meaning to do.
Yeah. So that's a good, fair point there too, and especially for children. Again, my son being 11 already happened to start reading some of these books. Let the raw realities just come from it. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Always a good starting point. But get into these books and always get into that initial feel, that initial emotion, that initial pull that we've all enjoyed growing up, and then allow that to, and back to, kind of the concept, as I was saying, those of you who are familiar with it, you were raised on it, it was read to you, etc. Put these kind of side by side. That's why I, have the books side by side and kind of work through it together as you're in each book. Just review it, keep them close, and then go, oh, okay, yeah, that's what Dr. Ward was talking about right here. This is here, Father Christmas right here. Yeah, that makes sense. Or, when you're going through it, keep them close. Keep them close. I think it'll encourage.
Yeah, and also if people are going to start reading Narnia for the first time ever, then they must start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Absolutely.
Not The Magician's Nephew. Publishers mislead readers into thinking that The Magician's Nephew should be read first by putting it with a number 1 on the spine, or in single volume editions of all 7 Chronicles, they print it first. But it's not the first story. It's in fact, it was published 6th, and it's much better read as a kind of flashback or a prequel than the actual opening of the series.
Yeah, I was actually very critical of that in some of the lineup readings for the school. It's like, he had it 6 for a reason. It wasn't first.
He did, yeah.
So very, very, very fair point. All right, Dr. Ward, thank you so much for joining this episode, folks. Again, the link is in the description of the video, and there are other writings that you can find from Dr. Ward. Keep up with his research. Hey, listen, we appreciate your time. We know it's precious, and you are very busy in the school, and then you're working as a faculty and as a professor and writer and all. I mean, you're doing a lot of work. So we appreciate you taking just this short segment to be with us, and also to tell everybody a little bit about your work and why it's valuable and we should all be reading it. So we appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Absolutely. All right, folks, that's all we have time for. Grace and peace to you.